sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
A ní wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One man, Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
A ní wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One man, Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
A ní wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. I'm no qua, Osinachi. One name, Osinachi. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. Mama, Osinachi.
A ní wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. I'm no qua, Osinachi. One name, Osinachi. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. Mama, Osinachi.
Wow, how wonderful. I hope everybody can hear me. If there are any issues, please use the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it, since I won't be saying all that much, hopefully, at the session. To start with, I just would like to welcome everybody on this panel. It's wonderful to see you here, to be part of the annual conference of the Lagos Studies Association. Many thanks to all the organizers and especially Professor Sahid Aderinto, who has done so much of the communication. I would very much like to welcome also our panelists today. In order of speaking, not order of seniority, please. We have here today with us Bronwyn Everell from the University of Cambridge. She's a historian of humanitarianism and settlement, Black settler societies in Sierra Leone and Liberia. We have Akin Iwilade from Edinburgh University, a political scientist and anthropologist who works on youth, violence and regional security. And we have Catherine Pieper from the Catholic University of Leuven, an anthropologist of media, religion, urbanism, aging, I could go on. The convener of the Congo Research Network, who works on the DR Congo. Myself, I am also an anthropologist and historian. I'm based at the University of Birmingham, as you can see from my little subtitle, and I work on Yoruba history and religion. We are hoping to be joined by a fourth panelist, Ollie Owen from the University of Oxford. So when he comes, I'll introduce him. The way we've planned this session is to have short presentations about graduate school applications and the experience in Europe from all panel members, and then hopefully to have some time for questions from the audience. Again, if you want to put those questions into the chat, or if you want to make your yourself known, I would try to work out how I can see everybody while we have the presentations. Then hopefully we can have a good conversation afterwards first. So as I said, in order of presentation, we'll start the presentation with Dr. Everell Bronwyn, if you'd be so kind.
Thank you. So yes, hi everybody. I teach history at Cambridge, and I'm the incoming director of the Center of African Studies. And so I am happy to talk about either history specifically and how to apply it to that, or if you have questions about the Center of African Studies as well. That is just an MPhil program, so that's just the master's, and you then have to move into a department for the actual PhD. So that's just a particularity of Cambridge. So I've been asked to talk quickly about sort of the various things that we're going to cover, and specifically, I guess, with an eye to how it all works in Cambridge. So the first thing to know about Cambridge is that there is both a college and a university experience at Cambridge, and so to keep an eye on two parts of the puzzle, and this is also true of Oxford as well. So in general, I think the things to consider when picking a grad program start with the sort of question of the supervisor, and making sure that there's a supervisor there who will fit with your research. And some programs are more interested in having that sort of exact match than others. But I think it's an important thing for thinking about framing the project, framing the proposal, which is an important part of the application process, and for thinking about what your cohort might look like. Because if there's somebody there who works on something that interests you, whether it's thematically, regionally, it doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect fit, that there will be other people working with them who will be fun to spend time with, and sort of help you to think about your topic from a variety of angles. So things to consider when picking a graduate program, I would say start with the supervisor, think about the cohort, about the research culture more generally. Are there a lot of research seminars in your interest areas? Do they bring in lots of speakers? Are there opportunities to engage with people from other universities on a regular basis? Do they have funding for travel, for doing research? And what part of your graduate work is going to be focused on teaching training? So are you going to be expected to do a lot of teaching, a little bit of teaching? Is there no teaching available? That will really sort of depend on what you want out of the program, but it's just something to pay attention to when you're thinking about where to apply. At Cambridge specifically, we have a lot of supervisions, which are like one-to-one meetings with undergraduate students, which provide a lot of opportunity for small amounts of teaching for postgraduate students, but they're very intensive and not necessarily as transferable to other universities in the long run. So you might want to think about whether whether you're planning to apply jobs in places where that's going to be useful, or whether you're going to think about needing more classroom style teaching and that kind of thing. In terms of contacting prospective supervisors in the Cambridge system, absolutely do this, because we don't actually see any of the applications until they get handed over to us by an administrator to say, yes, I do want to work with this person, or no, I don't want to work with this person. And so if we've had some interaction with the applicant before, and we know the sort of reason behind the project, we're much more likely to be enthusiastic about it when it crosses our desk. These come at a kind of random spurts all throughout the year as well. So it's not like we're sitting down with a batch of them and then comparing them to each other and, and making the selection based on, the best of the crop that comes to the top. These are, interspersed with all of our other things that we're doing. And so you'll get an email from the administrator saying, can you approve this? Do you or do you not want to supervise this person? And so if you're expecting it, if you've been in communication before and you're expecting it to come across, then it can fit more easily into your mental load for the day than if it's sort of like, oh, okay, that's something I have to address from scratch. I have to sort of set aside, an hour or two to look through that. So absolutely, if you're applying to Cambridge, probably very many other places, do get in touch ahead of time. And I would say, write a fairly extensive email explaining who you are, what it is that you plan to work on, asking if you think it's a good fit, maybe suggesting a Zoom meeting, but remembering that future supervisors are not, this sounds really crude, but are not getting paid for this time that they're putting in, right? They're going to be putting in this time because they want you to succeed. And so it's a really good signal for your future relationship if they do want to put in that time. If you have to follow up 2 or 3 times, maybe let it go. If you have to follow up once, that's probably okay because everybody's overworked. But think about reading those responsive signs as being, as being good or not. In terms of what admissions committees look for in an application, I would say, again, and I'm sure others will echo this, but in Cambridge, the proposal is the sort of primary thing. If the project sounds interesting, sounds feasible, and sounds like it's well thought out. The application process to the US is very different. And it's much more of a, build the project with your supervisor through the MA, et cetera. In Cambridge anyway, there's a sort of hit the ground running kind of aspect to it. So there will be tweaks to the project, of course, when you discuss with your supervisor when you get there, but the proposal should have the feel of something that's been well thought out and that is sort of really engaged with what the big questions are that you're thinking about engaging with, what sources are available, how you've thought about the project, and how it will fit into the sort of trajectory of the MPhil or the PhD. Yeah, so in terms of writing a competitive PhD proposal, then I would recommend writing as much of that as you can ahead of time, getting in touch with the supervisor, potentially getting feedback from them about the proposal, whether that's in writing or in a meeting, and really taking on board suggestions that they might have about how to improve it, if they have any. And part of that process is also sort of a signal about how well you will work together. And again, if they want you to do a totally different project than you want to do, that might be a good signal that you shouldn't work with that person. If instead they're suggesting things that will tweak it a little bit and move it in a direction that sounds exciting to you, then that's a good signal as well. So it's not always about doing what it is that your supervisor wants or your potential future supervisor wants. It's about finding a good fit with a supervisor who's going to get you to the project that you want out of it, and who will be thinking about what it is career-wise that you want out of your graduate studies, whether that's further graduate work or whether that's moving into a particular field. So think about this whole process as partially identifying somebody who's going to work well with you, as well as applying to a school that's going to help you in terms of your CV. Finally, in terms of funding at Cambridge, it's very specific because of this college university relationship. So there are lots of different funding opportunities, but they're very weirdly niche throughout the university. There is a website, which I will put in the chat, where you can go and search for funding opportunities that match your profile. So whether you're applying for an MPhil or a PhD, where you're applying from, and all of those what kinds of studies you want to do. And so I just put in something random while I was searching. So students from Nigeria who are looking for an MA, and 192 funding opportunities came up, and the same for a PhD, 287 came up. These are various sizes, and they're applicable to, some of them are Cambridge Trust, which is just for anybody applying. And some of them are 1 year of funding for somebody doing biological science on a very particular niche topic. So I recommend going to this website, having a play around, thinking about, whether your topic does or doesn't fit into that, maybe being a little bit creative, and thinking also about how you end up choosing a college within the Cambridge system based on what funding opportunities are available. I will leave it there because I feel like I've talked for a really long time. This is that's how it works at Cambridge. I've also taught at KCL in London, at Warwick, and at Oxford. So, but Ollie's here to talk about Oxford. But if you have any questions at all in the discussion, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. So I hope that was a really good overview. If anything is not clear, please at any time join the chat. And hopefully Dr. Iwilade will be able to also comment a little bit on what it looks like perhaps for somebody applying out of the Nigerian system, because I think that will be a concern for many people in this panel. So please, if I can invite you. Oh, and so my apologies. We have been joined by our fourth speaker, Ollie Earn from the University of Oxford, who's an anthropologist of politics and policing, and generally interested in the political economy, state institutions, and taxation. Right, so we'll hear him later. So to return to what I was saying earlier, please, I'm sure you're all very excited to hear Akin Iwilade speak.
Hello everyone. Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot to Said and the LSA. This is my first LSA, so I hope this won't be the last one. Thanks a lot for joining us. And I think that the I'm going to be wearing three, maybe four hats in kind of my brief comments. One is as the director of the PhD African Studies program here at Edinburgh. Um, the other one would be I'll be speaking as the pathway convener lead for the language-based area studies and international development pathway for the Scottish Graduate School of Social Sciences. So, which is what they call doctoral training partnerships in England. And I'm also going to be speaking as a supervisor and a potential PhD supervisor. And then the fourth hat, which is perhaps the most, by far, the most important one, is I'm going to be speaking as someone who has experience of the Nigerian university system and applying from Nigeria. So I'm going to try to juggle all those four hats. That's why I've got a pretty big head. So I think that so I guess one of the most important things for people applying from Nigeria is usually funding. Um, in many ways, uh, that's what makes all the difference, especially if you're thinking about a PhD. I mean, uh, for the masters, many people are able to find ways to self-fund, especially when if they go to schools that are slightly less expensive. So people tend to be able to um, try to find the funds in different ways. But for the PhD, it's an extremely difficult thing to do without funding. And I think that it's really important if you're planning to apply to graduate school. The first thing you should think about is funding, and in many ways, the search for funding is perhaps one of the most is perhaps every bit as important as the proposal itself. And so there are different ways to think about funding. One of it is the more kind of general countrywide, UK-wide type of funding. So I'd say funding from Commonwealth, for instance, Commonwealth shared scholarships and that kind of thing, where applications are not necessarily always university based. So that's one thing, and those kind of funding gives you a lot more flexibility to go to whatever university you want if you can get that kind of funding. Then there are of course also for Scotland there's the Scottish Graduate School of Social Sciences that also offers PhD funding every year, and this PhD funding is sometimes 1+3, so that's 4 year PhD funding, which includes elements of master's level training at the beginning, and this is also available across all the social science disciplines. Um, and we tend to get about 40 something of those every year, give or take, of funding around the for the SGSS funding. And then there are the university, kind of local university level funding. And these, like Brian mentioned, these are usually hidden in different pots all across the university. So some of them are college based, some of them are school based, which is what we would call faculties in Nigeria. So or departments in Nigeria. Some of them are kind of department based, faculty based, or college based. And when I say college now, I don't mean college in the Cambridge Oxford sense. I mean college in the proper sense, nice sense. Sorry, I just had to say that. But then there's also and there are the kind of more university wide scholarships. And my advice really is that if you're planning to start, say, September 2023, you should actually if you're planning to start your grad program September 2023, you should actually be looking for those, because most of those things will already have been advertised in some form or the other. If you're planning for September this year, well, maybe it's probably way too late for most universities to find funding. But the earlier you actually start thinking about funding, the better. And I think that one of the things to do is to look at the departments, to look at the universities. Not all of the opportunities that are there will get into the will actually get on social media into something you actually have to go dig to really dig for them. And it's also a good idea. It's generally also a good idea sometimes to email potential when you email potential supervisors to mention ask them to point you towards funding opportunities that may exist within their departments or universities or any funding opportunities that they might know of. Now, one of the things the I think that one of the things to think about with regard to funding is that funding applications are somewhat the competition for funding is different. It kind of is fundamentally different to say the competition for places on graduate programs. Now, competition for funding is usually tougher as you would expect, right? It's usually tougher because people who get funding you would usually have passed through that initial competition for graduate places themselves, and then meaning that everyone eligible to be considered for that funding more are actually eligible for the program itself, more likely, and so and which means that when making your application, even if you don't have to make a separate application for funding, so because there are some cases where it's the same application package that you use to apply for the program that is then used to assess, you have to bear funding in mind when you're making this application. And one of the things that I've found from my experience of assessing applications and PhD applications in particular, but also assessing funding applications at the SGSS and within Edinburgh here, is that sometimes if you're applying for a PhD program in particular, I've seen an increasingly, it seems that increasingly people increasingly tend to highlight professional experience. So things like internships, volunteering roles, and all of that. People tend to, I don't understand why that's happening now, but it seems like increasingly people tend to be highlighting those particular parts of their CVs in their cover letters, in all of that. I'm not saying that these things are not important, but if you're applying for a PhD program, it's really important that you bear in mind that that program is primarily an academic program. And what PhD supervisors, what selection panels want to see is somebody who is going to be an intellectual. We know that people do many things after PhD. We don't all have to do the boring job of being academics. But I think that it's really really important that when we're making these applications that we highlight our academic credentials. This is so important, and this is why the proposal is in many ways the most important part of that application. And for the proposal, one of the things that I found, one of the things I found in one of the things I found that I think that sometimes puts people at a disadvantage is, and I'm saying this having studied in Nigeria myself and having seen quite a number of Nigerian applications and emails from Nigerian students thinking of PhDs, is that there's this tendency to focus on the empirical contribution that your work might make. So you want to do a project on, say, I'm going to use INSA's project that I know. So you want to do a project on, say, religion and peaceful coexistence in Yoruba land, something like that. And then you write a proposal that talks about the very specific empirical contribution rather than starting off your proposal with that big question, with this idea that what's the big idea that your work, the conceptual idea that your project might be engaging with, and how does it sit in the broader kind of body of knowledge around that, and not recognizing that the case studies, that the empirical work that you're doing is simply helping us to better understand that big conceptual idea that people will be speaking to in different ways from across the world. And I think that many PhD proposals end up not looking interesting precisely because is so difficult to tease out. We can see what the empirical contribution might be, but we're not able to see, okay, how does this really speak to the rest of the literature? What's the big idea? What's kind of big conceptual idea that this project might engage with? And I think that what that does when you get a proposal like that doesn't seem to address these big ideas, is that it then signals that, well, it then signals to election panels, to supervisors, that one is that, well, if someone were not interested in this particular niche area that you need, kind of particular very niche area you're thinking about, why should anyone be interested? And note that many of the places that we study, they're not going to have there's not going to be universal interest in studying small parts of Nigeria, or perhaps even in studying Nigeria itself, right? But what you can hope to have some sort of universal interest is in that big idea, and that we're then using what we know, what we might find out about Nigeria, to feed into a global conversation about this so-called big idea. And I think that one of the other things that really needs to be taken seriously for the proposal would be the methods, that methodology section. And I think that we should all remember that that method section is not, it's not a tick box exercise where we just simply say, oh, I'm going to use I'm going to do 10 focus group discussions. I'm going to do key informant interviews, and I'm going to do I'm going to consult documents or something like that. That the idea is that we need to recognize that these that methods should be as innovative and interesting as possible. There are so many different ways within which we can study the things that we want to study, and the more interesting the methods are, the more likely that supervisors, selection panels will think, well, even if we don't necessarily think that this method necessarily does everything now, but you see that, yeah, this is something that could potentially be interesting for everybody involved in this project, and therefore you're way more likely to be to find support in that regard. And I think that one other thing that I'm going to kind of close with here is getting in touch with supervisors prior to application. If you're planning a PhD application, I think it is absolutely essential that you get in touch with supervisors. Now, getting in touch with supervisors does not mean that you should send um, emails to every member of faculty to say, oh yeah, I'm doing just change the name and then send the same thing to people, because people receive these kinds of emails all of the time, and people, the carrying capacity for each individual faculty is quite small, right? So there's only so many PhD students that people can accept every year, which means that you're way more likely to interest a potential supervisor if you actually customize the emails to them. So you write the email explaining precisely why you think your project, why you want what you want to do, why you think they will be a good fit for that project, and why the department that you intend to apply to will be a good fit to that project. And if you interest this supervisor, in many ways, that's like 30-40% of your job done, because if there is a willing supervisor, the chances that you will get an offer is significantly increased. And so I'll just say that do plan ahead. Um, Plan ahead. If you're planning to apply for September 2023, this is probably the time to start thinking about what you want to do. I would also say that get in touch with potential supervisors, but don't just blast emails out to all members of faculty. Be really, really deliberate about who you are emailing, why you're emailing them, what you think that your work might contribute to them. And it's really important that even though departments want you to be able to demonstrate how your work might fit within the department, note that department generally also want something new and unique. So you have to find that balance between demonstrating that you're bringing something new that no one else is doing in the department, but that it is not so niche that no one can understand what you're saying in the department, so that it is new, unique, but it also fits within the broader intellectual agenda and expertise that exists within the department. I guess I'm going to stop there, so that in case there are questions. But thanks a lot, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much for this excellent advice, Akin. Thanks very much. We'll move on to Ollie Owen, our third panelist who'll speak to institutions in the UK. Ollie, if I could ask you to make yourself visible. There you are. Thank you.
Visible. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Inso has asked me to play a kind of sweeper role. That if there's any kind of loose balls on the pitch, I should go and collect them and try and put them back in play. So let me try and do that. But also, I mean, my fellow panelists have done lovely jobs, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces. Yeah, I think some things will overlap a little bit what's been said, but let me just touch on them again briefly because I would like to underline them. I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe my own experience and the way that I came into doctoral study after some time out of academia, because I think that's kind of universally relevant. It doesn't really matter which country you're starting from. Some of it about research councils in the UK, which are another major academic funder. And also, this panel is about graduate study. We've just been talking about PhD. I presume some people here are also interested in masters, right? So I might say some words about masters and how that relates too. So I think the first thing to say about PhD is I just always say this to everybody, anybody who comes to me talking about interest in applying for PhD. The first and central thing to kind of write at the top of your mental piece of paper is a PhD is not a qualification, right? So I want to do my PhD is not a reason to do a PhD. As in, it might be your personal motivation, but it's not going to be enough for anybody in doing admissions and it will show through. A PhD is an original piece of research. So we need to, you know, in your application, in your contacts, we need to think about your interest, your direct interest in that research. It needs to come through. We need to understand why that's really interesting to you and how you personally are going to go at it. And that is where it all starts. Everything, proposal, relationships with particular supervisors, all comes from there. I think the second thing is, maybe this has been said, but of course there is two different PhD tracks. There is the kind of PhD that's more common in the sciences where, you know, a big professor or research group has got a certain project and they're going to break it down into PhD sized projects and then you apply for it more like a job. And in Scandinavia, in fact, a PhD is a job, it has a salary. So if you're applying to Scandinavian countries, well done, get in there, you'll have a salary. And that's the kind of sciences model. And then the social sciences, humanities model that we tend to deal more with in this conference is usually this individual proposal-led PhD, right? But sometimes there's crossovers. So sometimes, I mean, I remember recently a migration studies project that had 3 places for PhD students on it. Well, if you're going for that kind of PhD, bear in mind that what Bronwyn has said about the vision of you and the supervisor is even more important, right? Because they are going to see that as a concept that they've already given birth to, and they want someone to come along and collaborate and fill in certain aspects. You know, they might be wanting someone who really, you know, is a strong thinker with a strong kind of defined ground, and they don't have that. But chances are they're going to have more of an idea of what the parameters of that project will be. So you're going to have to work more with their vision. Whereas in the individually led one, it will be a matter of the meeting of your vision and what the supervisor feels that they can help you do. So just, you know, read these PhD adverts for funding really carefully, because if it says, you know, I don't know, so funding bodies inviting PhD applications, that's just the individual kind of PhD application. If it is that so project has 3 PhD scholarships with people looking at, yes, they want to hear your proposal about how you would go at that, but the field is already a little bit more defined. So just be aware of the kind of conversation that you want to have with that. I'll just give you my own kind of journey towards doing a PhD. Yeah, I always had that idea that I would like to go do my PhD, but that, you know, didn't have a form to it. So I just left it until I thought what I really want to do a PhD about. And this was every time I was traveling around Nigeria, I was meeting policemen at roadblocks who were sticking guns in my face. So I went to look for something to read that explains why the police act the way they do, and there wasn't anything very current, so I thought that would be a good PhD. This is something I could sit down with for 4 years that has some meat on it that would be worth approaching. So I said, okay, who do you do a PhD like that with? So, okay, there isn't anybody really doing it. I'm an anthropologist. I know I wanted to go back to anthropology. I didn't want to go to some kind of statistical criminology because it just bores me. So who in kind of anthropology, sociology, political science is working on issues? Okay, no one is working on policing in Africa. But there are 2 people that are really good that are working on vigilantism, which is very close, right? It's popular policing. So I went to see Insa Nolta, who is here with us and chairing the panel, and I went to see David Pratton in Oxford. And the conversation I literally had at that point was, I'm really interested in this field, thinking it might be worth a PhD study. I had one or two ideas about how to go at it. What do you think? And they were both very helpful in, talking that through. And by the way, of course, I'm in the UK, I have that advantage, but that's still something you can do by email, by Zoom, right? You can still have those engagements. We live in a more collapsed sort of world spatially. And I ended up going to Oxford, and the reason was simply that, I had great conversations with Insa and David, but David just kind of went through some concepts that were slightly closer to the way that I was thinking about it at the time. And I hadn't heard of all of them before, actually I was like, citizenship. Yeah, that is a good word, and it was just like, so it just plugged into the way I was seeing it more. And, this is, I think, a good grounding for developing ideas then, right? And then, move to a stage of, okay, have you read X, Y, and Z? And you begin to read while you're doing your application. And then you come to something. And then I literally went for a walk one day and I was like, got it. And I just like 2 pages. So I was like, this is how this fits together. This is what the application is. And then obviously that's the first draft and you work on it more. So I think the thing is that even the application is a journey, right? It involves relationship building and intellectual exploration. And I think the key thing to say to somebody anywhere in the world really is that what I look for more than anything else as an admissions tutor when I'm looking at that is, how does your idea of your work relate to the existing body of work in this field, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you're supposed to have read everything before you come for your PhD, but we want to, and we make huge allowances for the fact that, not everybody has a library available to them with the same access. But again, things are more accessible now than they were electronically in some of these things. And we are in a format like this. LSA, I think, is fantastic for allowing this kind of cross-fertilization without frontiers. So it's not that we expect you to have read everything, but we want to know, what some key things that have been done in this field recently that you might have noticed exist, and like how your ideas maybe are like, I'm very much influenced by this, or I kind of don't like this, and I'm thinking of going in a different direction. I'm thinking of combining this and this. We don't want to think that you've just come up with this idea in a vacuum. Of course, at the beginning of an engagement of it, that's fine. We might suggest to you things you've read. It might be that you're approaching people because specifically of what they've written about. And that's a very strong reason to want to go somewhere and work with people. But what we want by the time it's an application is that there's this linkage. This is how this, it's not just the big ideas, as Akin says, it's also your position in relation to them, as Akin also says. So we want to know that you've read some stuff, and you've thought about why you want to do this. I think another no-no is that we want people to set out the logic of their study and not assume that we know stuff. But we don't. I get these very curious applications sometimes that sort of act, that write as if no one has ever researched on Nigeria before. And I wonder how, so look at your application and think, read it through before you send and think, okay, am I explaining things clearly, but I'm showing that there is a kind of path towards this research and as a field it fits into. I think that's one way to get at. Research Councils UK is the government body in the UK that funds PhD and a lot of postdoctoral and a lot of large research projects. And it's split into different research councils for arts, humanities, medical sciences, physical sciences, and others. So it's field specific. And they support projects on a merit and strictly academic merit basis. And the RC UK projects and scholarships and funding is open to anybody from anywhere in the world. But it's not dedicated to specific countries. It is open to overseas students, but it's very, very much on academic strength, and that's the only criteria, right? So, think about applying that if you have a very good academic track record already. Think about it if maybe you've done some of the stuff in the UK system, but think about it primarily wherever you are, whoever you are, if you've got a really solid project that's got a really good methodology to it, because that's what they're looking at. They're looking at stuff that will push the frontiers of research. And I think I will just add, Atkins addressed methodology a lot, and especially ESC, a funder like that that's very keen on methodology. We don't expect you to have done the PhD before you do the PhD, right? We don't expect you to know exactly which methodology is going to yield which results. And we do research training in our courses. That's why we have it, But what we want you to know is that you've thought a little bit about where the answer might lie, in which part of the terrain the answer might lie. And we want to know about methodology, not just because it's innovative for its own sake, but because you want to think about the fit of the method to the kind of data you're trying to get, right? So you're a historian, but you're researching, I don't know, histories of something that happens within the home. Are there going to be many documentary sources? No, they're not. So why are you supplementing them with this? Okay, what else? You know, oral history, how are you using that? You know, we want to know a little bit about the fit when you talk about methodology, so that, you know, this will evolve. A PhD proposal isn't the finished version, but we want to know that, yeah, this is very promising. We can work with this. Absolutely engage with us before you do. Obviously, as Bronwyn has said, there's a line between engaging constructively and pestering, and just make sure that you're being courteous and understand that people are doing this on top of their other job. I think the other thing I wanted to say about funding, by the way, I've seen situations before. We don't have as much funding to give out as we'd like. We don't have as much scholarship. If you apply for a PhD and the funding reply that you get back is, we can just give you like 1 year's funding. What that doesn't mean is we don't like you enough to give you 3 years. What that means is we're looking for funding for you and we just found 1 year. Now, if you have another school that says, I give you full funding package, of course you should go for it. But generally what that means is we're trying to find somebody a foot in the door. So you should come. You should take that 1 year's funding with the kind of assurance that once you're in the system, we'll still support you to look for further funding. Because otherwise we don't want to get people in trouble. We're not trying to give people the first year PhD funding and then leave them and abandon them, right? And this is not the intention. The intention is maybe there was just a funding pot and we want to still try and find something for someone. And I know 2 or 3 people that have gone to very successful PhDs, but came in with just enough funding for the first master's year. Some schools and some departments in some schools, for international development in Oxford, do a 2-year research master's in MPhil, which you then translate into 2 further years, which becomes a PhD. And so that's sometimes a way of breaking this thing in half if you're not sure. And I think that brings me to the final thing I wanted to talk about, which was kind of masters and the relationship between masters and further study, you know? And of course, you can think about masters as something on its own, and that might be a taught or research masters. You can think about masters as something that bridges you from a subject area you already do to another. Maybe you read history and you want to go to anthropology. So you think maybe I need to do the 1-year anthropology masters to translate and be a credible candidate for anthropology PhD. Maybe you want to do a master's because an MPhil 2-year research master's could be enough on its own, and then you decide whether you want to go to PhD or not. And these are all valid. They're all very, very valid. But I think you should also talk, if you are, when you're selecting your master's, you should think beyond your master's. What is this for? Where is it supposed to get? Is it just that I want to take the next level and break a kind of glass ceiling, become more employable? Is it that I want to convert to a different topic to then do something else? Is it that I want to dip my toe in the research thing to see if I can go further? So you apply to the master's thinking about where that gets you next, not just because you have a selection bag and you like it. And then when you're doing that, let's say your ultimate aim is to work in research, but not academic research. You talk to people who work in that field about why you're choosing that master's. You know, your ultimate aim is to go into PhD, and you say, I don't know whether to do the taught master's that converts me from one subject to another, or go straight for this MPhil. Talk to the people who will actually be doing that PhD stuff in the long run, so that you're making the right decision on the way. And I also know that there's this kind of complicating factor now, because a lot of people are also looking at graduate study overseas as a step on a kind of family relocation chain, right? So people are looking not only at their kind of career academic prospect, but the fact that they're expecting family and, you know, they want to do it overseas. I think there was a BBC survey recently, 57% of people surveyed across 4 countries were looking at immigration as a kind of career path. And so this brings in other considerations, right? Like the schemes that we have for, you know, qualified migrants post-masters in the UK currently. It looks at things like the cost of living for your family, or if you have a partner, where they might find work. And these are all real world considerations, right? But the thing is, I think to start off with the academic track and look at that, what works for that, narrow that down, and then look at these compatibility things as 2 separate issues. Where's the crossover between the life compatibility and the academic track? If you try to sort of select both for both criteria at once, you just give yourself a headache. And even your application would kind of reflect the fact that it doesn't really have a coherence. So I think the narrative is really important with we admissions tutors, even when there are limited scholarships for people doing masters, because there sometimes are. It's about the narrative. This is where I want to bring it to rest. Why this thing? Why you? Why this school? What you're going to bring to it. These are the things that essentially make your application move from the maybe pile to the definitely admit pile. These are the things that make your application, make us think about ticking that box, submit for scholarship board or not. It's why this person for this thing at this time in this school. Does it make sense? Is it strong? And I think, you need to explain that to yourself as a strong narrative before you even put it on paper. So I'll park it there. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And thanks for all the very sort of concrete examples there. I think that's really, really helpful for people. And now we're moving on from the UK and the UK system, which is kind of very specific, especially because of the large costs that are normally involved in, just in being registered for a degree, to Katrien, who's working, as I said, at the Catholic University of Leuven, and who can talk more about the Belgian and perhaps the European system. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces, voices, names as well. And this is also my very first presentation at the Legal Studies Association. On Thursday, tomorrow evening, I have another one, but I feel a bit like an interloper. I do research on Kinshasa, but tomorrow I'm part of a book discussion. So it's nice to dip my toes in this Nigerian academic community. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm also happy to talk a bit about, I will mainly talk about Flemish, Flemish university world, because there's something peculiar compared to the other Dutch and German, French systems. So maybe I'll start with the very good news compared to the UK. In Flanders, it's actually very cheap to do a PhD. You pay twice enrollment fees. It is in the year that you start your PhD, and you pay also the enrollment fee in the year that you're going to defend your PhD. And brace yourselves for the amount of money that you're going to pay twice. You're going to pay twice 490 euros. So that's it. With 490 euros in year one and 490 euros in your year two, you can get a PhD degree. You have a PhD, a card as a PhD student. You have access to all the university facilities. You get all the reductions that students get, and you have access to the courses. You're enrolled as a PhD student. So financially, it's very cheap. It's very democratic compared to other areas. So but it's not that easy to, enroll as a PhD student. Not everybody who pays 490 euros can be a PhD student. Actually, it's the other way around. You first need to be accepted as a PhD student, and then you will get an invitation to pay the 490 euros. So how to get at that phase, at that stage, to be enrolled and accepted as a PhD student? A bit like Ollie already said, like in Scandinavia, you can be hired on projects. And that is one of the major ways in Flanders. So Flanders is a Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. So in Flanders, I would say there are like 4 ways in which you can get enrolled in a PhD as a PhD student. The first one, and that would be most probably the easiest one, I would guess, is responding to vacancies. So many of us, me as well, we get major research grants, and we can hire PhD students. For example, as from February probably in October this year, I will have 3 vacancies for 3 PhD students. Every vacancy will identify a particular topic, a particular field of research. And so people who feel like they want to go to Kenya or they want to go to Congo to do research on that particular topic, which will be climate urgency, then they can submit what will be requested in the vacancy text, usually a CV, probably a 2-page text and maybe a sample of writing. And then based on the amount of applications that I get, I will make a short list, and then I will interview people who have submitted their CV for the vacancies. So this means you would not come up with your own research question, although obviously, the research question is broadly defined, so you will be able to bring in, your own research agenda, but the overall topic of climate urgency will have to be met with. And so you will be paid for, the duration of the project. You will get well paid. You will be contributing to social security. So you will have a double role. You will be a PhD student, while at the same time you will be an employee at the university. So it means that you will also have a lot of obligations towards the university, because you will have a work contract, which means you commit to finalizing the PhD. That's the first way in which you, in Leuven, for example, my university, but also in other universities, you can get enrolled. The second way is to come up with your own fellowship, to apply for funding at a funding institution. And in Flanders, we've got the Flemish Board of Scientific Research. The abbreviation is FWO. FWO, there's a website, www.fwo.be, and every year there is a deadline for funding applications for doctoral fellows, and if you get that, then you get 4 years of funding. You're also paying towards social security, but you are submitting your own research project. And my advice is, don't submit it on your own, because there's also somewhere a line in the application process in which you need to identify the prospective supervisor, and the prospective supervisor will also be invited to write a letter of recommendation saying, yes, if this fellowship is awarded, I'm happy to be the supervisor. I know this project is close to my expertise. We've been in touch before. I've given feedback on the application itself, and so on. To be honest, this is like the golden gate. Through the FWO money, this is your own project. Your supervisor is, a mentor in the shadows, but you're not working for your supervisor. And even if there would be a conflict between you and your supervisor, you'd be easily able to change supervisors, for example, which is more difficult if you're entering in a conflict with the supervisor on whose project you're hired. Then the third way through which you can get into a PhD program in Flanders is if you come up with your own money. For example, what we see, some students from various African countries may have some backing from church organizations. And then the university may request evidence, financial evidence, because they also, doing a PhD costs, despite the enrollment fee, that may be very cheap. But if you need to work full time while, funding, while paying for your livelihood, it is very difficult to focus on your PhD research. So it's a kind of protective measure that university then would request, okay, provide some evidence, or someone writing a letter saying, I'm a guarantee that person will, maybe only part-time have to work. I can pay, for the flat, for example. And then finally, if you're already a teaching assistant or a research associate in another project, or teaching assistant in a particular department, then you can also start a PhD project. Usually then it is connected to, some of the teaching that you've done, or some of the other research that you've been doing. So based on these 4 starting points, then the then you would have, you would have a supervisor already with whom you're in touch, and that supervisor will talk to the secretary, give your email address, and say, okay, I've had so many conversations with that person. I am convinced that that person, I want to supervise a PhD project of that person. We can start the formal enrollment and administrative procedures. And so you will get a invitation via email to start the formal registration online into the university, into the university's system. Oh, there's another one that I forgot to mention, the fifth one, which is, but I didn't mention it because Nigeria is not in the list, but I should mention it because I'm sure not everybody in the room here is from Nigeria. There's another funding scheme from the Flemish government that is called Global Minds. And the Global Minds funding scheme from the Flemish government wants to enhance global North, global South academic collaborations. And there's a specific pillar for students from the global South for PhD funding from students from the global South. At various times, the list of countries from which applicants can be changes. And I checked yesterday, and that's why I saw Nigerian citizens are at this point not invited to apply for a Global Minds Fellowship. I'm going to read very quickly the names of the countries. So there are countries in Latin America and in Asia, but they're not relevant here. The countries from Africa, African citizens, people from Benin, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Guinea, Cameroon, Kenya, Madagascar, and Mali. So the Flemish government has given Global Minds funding to all the Flemish universities, and so they have this particular budget that they can give for PhD funding to citizens of that country. And usually there as well, you already have a supervisor from that university, and that's the same procedure. Once the supervisor from that university has, is convinced that, you're well prepared and that this will be a good fellowship, good project, then they can advise you to apply for Global Minds Fellowship funding, through our university, for example. Usually these projects need to have a strong development-related component. And there's also usually a strong request that then the PhD student, after the PhD degree has been awarded, goes back to the home country and starts teaching in the home country. There's this eagerness of contributing to what is called capacity building in the Global South. So these are the ways of getting funding. Then you start with the online procedure. And first, what the university then will be doing is they will be vetting your CV and the BA and MA degrees that you have received. And there is a ranking of universities. Some universities are blacklisted, and some universities are not. And so if you're, if the university accepts your BA and MA degree, then your file will immediately go to the doctoral committees within the faculty, who will be reading, your CV, who will be reading a summary of your project, who will be informed about the funding background, and who will also hear the supervisor. And then based on that, they will give you either green light or orange light or red light. Red light means they're not convinced that there's a match, or that, that the project is scientific enough and so on, which, hardly happens, because usually the supervisor, the prospective supervisor, is also co-responsible for the quality of the file that is being submitted. So that rarely happens. Orange light may happen. Orange light may be, we need more information about the funding. For example, if the student says, I'm going to be self-funded, so they could ask for information of, how do you guarantee, that for the next 4 years you will assure funding? Or they may say, we're not really convinced about the supervisor. So they may say, we want a co-supervisor that, has more expertise either in the area or in the topic and so on. Or they may also say, we're not convinced that you've got the right academic preparations for it, so we will request you to do what we call a pre-doctoral year, which also costs 490 euros to enroll. And after at the end of the pre-doctoral year, then you would have to do an exam. You've got to pass, and then you could start the PhD program as such. The pre-doctoral year then usually is composed of a set of courses that the supervisor with members of the doctoral committee identify, also together with the student, based on what is feasible and what is required in order to get what they consider the best preparation for the PhD project. And then, with the green lights, then you can start your PhD project. So I'm going to stop here because I think there are many questions, and I also want to give room to the floor to ask more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrien, and thanks everybody for your patience and engagement. I see there's been a sort of lively exchange going on in the chat, and we've also had a couple of questions through the Q&A. Now, I've tried to keep track of questions from the beginning, so if you haven't been answered, and perhaps I could ask the panelists or one or two of the panelists to just volunteer if I read out the questions that are still on my list to address. So the first question was, is it okay to give a list of schools you're applying to in a specific application? Are there any views from the panelists on this?
I think Cambridge asks for that directly, but I don't think it has any impact on whether you will be admitted or not. I think they just ask for their statistical purposes.
Yeah, I would say that I have not heard that this would have an impact on anything. It's just additional information. Equally, I don't know if it's been required. Akim, do you?
No. I think it's just for statistical purposes. It's okay. That's no bearing on the application. Yeah.
All right. Then I have another question, which is a bit more specific, which came up in the chat earlier, where somebody asked, I applied for a PhD in population health at Oxford after an MSc in Bedford, have returned to Nigeria, have done quite a bit of work. 7 years later, do I stand to a chance to apply again? Perhaps we'll ask Ollie to respond to this, as this is specifically about Oxford. Unless he's popped out for now. In that case, perhaps I'll just stand in and say and reiterate the point that Ollie has made, that it's really about the proposal itself. Ollie, if you want to jump in.
I am here, but I didn't hear the question.
Oh, right. Somebody who applied for a PhD at Oxford some years ago, has returned to Nigeria, spent some time working, and was asking whether a reapplication would stand a chance.
Yeah, it's treated just the same as in your application. It's just the same thing exactly. And so you just said it's on the application, the merit, the research, the narrative, the strength of the application. It doesn't have any relationship to whether you applied previously.
Yes. If I could just, I hope that is not too direct. I'm not British, so you forgive me if this is too direct. So the strength of the application, it is really just the proposal. And perhaps as far as the UK is concerned, if you've had a first-class degree, that is the thing that makes you really competitive in applications for UK funding. And of course, that is quite rare. and it's quite hard. It's quite a hard threshold, and it's one of the results of opening UK funding, I think, very widely, which is perhaps one of the reasons why that is such a frustrating topic in many applications.
I guess just to add to that, by the way, just that's something to think about if you really think that maybe you didn't perform as well as you should have performed, and you're thinking about this master's thing as a intermediate stage, you know, that you can, you know, if I can get into master's, I can really show I can get to that level, and then I'm more competitive for the funding. That's another reason why people sometimes look at masters.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we had a question about a bachelor in English literature and MA in theatre media arts and the chances of funding for a PhD in cultural politics or African literature. Ollie answered this question, but it was actually directed at the time at Akin directly. So if there's anything you'd like to add to this, Akin, I'll hand the word to you.
So I think that there seems to be, unfortunately, it's not as much funding in the humanities generally, I think, which is a shame. I think there's not as much funding in the humanities more generally. But my advice would be that if you're thinking of something like cultural politics and you want to apply to the social sciences, insofar as you're able to show that at least 50%. So I mean, I don't know how that is measured, but you know, some 50%. That's the SGSS rule, that at least 50% of the project is social sciences. Then you would be eligible for social science type of funding. So so maybe one way to make it more likely that you'd be eligible for a wider range of funding is to try to make the project as interdisciplinary as possible, and then that kind of makes it more likely that you can tap into different pots of money here and there. But I echo all of what Ollie said in the way he answered the question initially. So
thank you so much. I think that hopefully has also addressed the question about the link between the MA topic and the PhD. So the emphasis really is on the proposal, the quality of the proposal itself, but of course you may need to explain. I think Ollie and Bronwyn respond to this online. Katrine and Akin, is there anything you'd like to say to this?
On the
yes.
link between the MA, well, I think that it's important to note that having done planning to do a PhD on an area where you can demonstrate previous expertise via the MA thesis, for instance, or previous publication, it's a good thing. So it's not a bad thing, but what is also important to note here is that we don't want you to simply come to repeat the MA thesis. So you have to show that there are skills that you're transferring, expertise being transferred from the MA thesis, but that the PhD is clearly a new and bigger project. And I think that that's where those who have done so much work sometimes struggle, because it's then a bit more difficult to show that you're actually going to be doing something new. But it's not a disadvantage in and of itself that you are building on what you did for the MA, insofar as you're able to show that you are simply drawing from the skills you may have learned from that, and then you're doing something actually new and bigger.
Thank you. Again, I think that's a really great answer. We had a question about the availability of specific funding for specific topics, which I believe has been partly answered by your references to different funding bodies for humanities and social sciences, at least in the UK. But I wonder if one of you would like to explicate a little bit further. Bronwyn, you also spoke a lot about very different pots. So perhaps I should just say, in the UK, social sciences and humanities are publicly funded through different bodies, which receive different allocations from the government. So different topics indeed have access to different funding. And as Akin very rightly said, at the moment there's a strong emphasis by the government, stronger emphasis on social sciences compared to humanities. So for those of you who are humanities scholars, but who can find a way to link that topic to social science approaches, that may be a useful way forward. The related questions from the same person or questioner were, does the board's interest lead to funding, and does marital status matter? Panelists, I'm just leaving this open. Yeah.
I don't think it's legal for marital status to matter.
Right.
Whether it does or not, I don't know. I don't think it's legal. So I don't think they're allowed to take that into consideration. It might come in once you've been admitted, when you have to prove that you have the funds to support yourself for a visa, that kind of stuff. But from the admissions perspective, it really shouldn't matter. And I would be very angry if I found out it did matter.
Maybe to add to that, indeed, so it should not matter, but it may matter for the applicants, because not all funding allows people to bring their family over to the other country. So what we often see is that only the scholar comes over and misses the family. There are other fellowships, especially the European funds. They actually have mobility grants with which they can fund the trip from family members to also the new country. So some funding schemes have that additional family allowance. Other funding schemes do not. So, but that does not interfere with admission into the university as a PhD student. That's just, facilitating or not the family life. And then the question, I think the board is whether the board has funding. I think the board is meant to us, the panelists. And if so, I'll have 3 vacancies that will be published most probably in October, November. But one will be to do research in Kenya, and the 2 others will be to do research in the DRC in Congo. But yeah, watch out the Facebook page of the Legal Studies Association. I'm part of a larger project. There will be 12 vacancies overall for anthropology on the topic of climate urgency, but only the 3 that I will be supervising are on Africa. The others are in Asia, Latin America, Europe, and you can apply for that as well. Anyone will be able to apply. You will be able to apply for one of the projects in Sri Lanka, for example, or in Argentina. Yeah, watch out the Facebook page. Watch out. I'll post them on the Facebook page of the Legal Studies Association.
Thank you, Katrine. Just very generally, just in case you meant the board of supervisors, the questioner. The board of potential supervisors normally does not have funds to give out. However, it is perhaps useful to bear in mind that within sort of consortia, usually there are regional groups of universities that receive funding from the government funding agencies. Academics will make a decision on the quality of proposals that should be funded. Now, the thing to bear in mind is that the academics who will read these funding proposals will not necessarily have an interest in Africa or Nigeria. They might come from all kinds of disciplinary backgrounds. So by the time a prospective supervisor suggests that you're ready to go to apply for a scholarship funded by government, they will probably also advise you on how to reconceive your proposals so that it's easy to read for somebody who's a philosopher working on Indian societies, or somebody who studies 19th century Britain, or symbolism in Australian cities. Akin, again, because you've had so much experience, perhaps it's worth for you to comment on this again.
I don't know if I've got so much experience, but a couple of years at least. Um, I mean, like you said, supervisors tend not usually. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what the questioner means by the board.
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure what that really means. But if it means this panel, if the board means this panel, I'll say that here, if you're thinking about if you're working within the social sciences, or you can connect your work in some form to the social sciences, I would strongly advise that you consider applying to SGSS, the Scottish Graduate School of Social Sciences, because I think there are usually about 60 PhD scholarships available every year. And if you're thinking of applying to Edinburgh, we tend to get up to about half of those every year. So, but this is for this kind of spreads across all of the disciplines of the social sciences, and there are also school level, quite a number of school level scholarships, faculty level scholarships that are usually available for these different things. And where there are specific projects, those are usually advertised outside of normal scholarship application timelines. So there could be a particular project on cities and crowds or something like that, and that's usually advertised separately. And interestingly, from my experience, I found that those kinds of very niche applications don't tend to get advertisements don't tend to get that many applications. So you might think, oh, this is an absolutely competitive thing and all of that, and sometimes it's probably going to be 10 applications, just that. But I remember there was one on religion, and there was one on religion that was advertised at Edinburgh not too long ago, where until 2 days before the deadline, we were actually worried we were going to get just one application, because it was such a niche project that nobody just seemed to apply until. So 2 days before the application, we were panicking. We were saying, "Oh, we're going to get just one application. We have to re-advertise this." And then some of the applications came through. But the point I'm making here is that those very specific application advertisement are usually not. There are not that many people applying for these things. So if you're doing something that's related, if you think that you've got the expertise that might take you into that, I strongly advise people to try to apply for these things, because if you don't apply, you never know whether your project's actually what people are looking for. So people should actually do try to apply for these things if they find it interesting.
Thanks so much. And Ollie, you had something to say.
Yeah, no, it's just something that Katrine's comment jogged. It's not a direct reply to this, but she's just talking about other parts of the world. And I just wanted to say something. I think everybody that's come to this panel is, largely the kind of up and coming generation of African scholars from Nigeria. And I just wanted to say that your ambitions should be as global as anybody else's. We've been assuming here that you're applying to do some kind of research project about Nigeria. Doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't, and we don't want you to feel like you have to be like that, right? So for instance, to give you two examples, I've got a colleague right now in Oxford who was interested in host communities in oil producing areas. So when she went for her SOAS PhD, she actually decided, in collaboration with the potential supervisor, to study that issue in Kenya, not in Nigeria. Because we know a lot of the issues in Nigeria. So what do we learn from looking at somewhere where it's just coming up, it's emerging? So she is now a British academic of Nigerian origin who's an expert on Kenya, right? Equally, the man who writes us, Teju Cole, that you would know from the world of literature maybe, has a PhD from Columbia in Dutch Renaissance painting, right? Don't parochialize yourself. It's bad enough that the world does it to you. Do you know what I mean? So if you have a strong reason to say, well, you know what, in Nigeria, there's a lot, and it can come from Nigeria, outwards, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't need to know what you don't know. It could be that you've observed that in Nigeria, there is this big thing about conspiracy theory because everyone on the internet is. So I want to study conspiracy theory in comparative perspective and go and look at Nigerian conspiracy and US conspiracy theory and learn, great, brilliant. Globalize your intellectual ambition. Do that. Don't be afraid. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's an excellent point. We have another question here where somebody contacted a professor about an internship and the person did not respond. Does anybody want to comment on that?
I want to comment that again. I'm the worst person for not responding. I'm horrible. You can mail me 3 or 4 times, I might not respond. Partly because we check email on our phone sometimes and we're in the middle of dropping kids off at school and shit. It just happens. We're not horrible. Just maybe try and, politely try and pick times, remind us. Please exercise patience. We're human and not always that good at that either. Thank you.
Yeah, but to add to that, I started smiling because, that's the thing, checking on mobile phones and suddenly the mail is seen as read. And then, if you're going in your inbox on your computer, you're looking to the unread. But also, I would say, give us like a week or 10 days. Don't send 3 days later a reminder about your email that you haven't gotten a response yet. So, if within 10 or 14 days, you have not yet received a response, then, send a kind reminder like, hey, I sent this email so far, I don't see a response of you yet. Could you maybe have a look at my email? This is really, usually we're not ghosting people. It's more a matter of, this technical thing, suddenly it's marked as read and then it falls off your radar, or just, being a bit overwhelmed during particular times of exams, for example. Or at the conference, then you don't have time to look at your inbox. Just send some kind reminders, even if it takes 3 or 4 weeks, and 3 or 4 reminders, but don't give up.
But also, if you are going to be the kind of person who is really bothered by that throughout the entire PhD, think about whether that person is going to be somebody you want to work with. I, like the others, I'm extremely bad at checking my phone and then failing to reply. And if a student wanted to work with me and found that very irritating, I would feel bad for them because I'm not going to change. I'm still going to be like that. And I don't want them to have a bad experience of the PhD because this bothers them. And so if that is something that you're like, I cannot put up with that, I need to have a response within 3 days, then the person who responds to you within 3 days, yeah.
I would just like to add a small thing on internships, if I may. So in the UK, at least, the regulations usually mean that if we have paid internships available, they have to be advertised. We cannot give them out on the basis of, liking someone. So if there is something like an internship that is clearly defined, not a PhD, it has to be advertised. So if you're contacting somebody about a paid internship, they may also, and out of the blue, they may also think that the email has gone to the wrong person. So it may be worth setting out in more detail what it is that you are expecting, rather than just sending the same email again. Thanks. I had a last list. There is quite a lot of conversation here, but I had another list here, and that was a question about pre-doctoral fellowships. We had a few responses here. My own department used to have regular pre-doctoral fellowships. We don't at the moment. We only used to advertise them, again, fairly regularly on jobs.ac.uk. But I'd like to open this again for the panelists to say something about the availability of pre-doctoral fellowships. So there is no government program for pre-doctoral fellowships, but quite a lot of institutions offer them, often irregularly.
So Cambridge has these mysterious things called junior research fellowships, which are college-based, so they're organized from college to college, and they're all very different. Some of them prefer people to be finished, to have a PhD in hand, but some of them are equally open to people who are in the writing up phase of their PhD. They are very intensive to apply to because you have to apply, and each college has its own regulations and they don't have a standard deadline, and they're very mysterious. And yeah, it's a difficult world to navigate. So if you are thinking about applying to one of those, I would reach out to somebody in your subject at the college and ask them what it is that the college is particularly looking at. They tend to be especially good for humanities and sciences. Social sciences tend to sort of fall out in the junior research fellowship competitions. Those are the only sort of pre-doctoral fellowship stuff that we have, and those tend to be for 3 or 4 years. So it's supposed to sort of see you through the end of the PhD and into a sort of postdoc.
Fantastic. So we had another question which Katrine has answered online. So we are nearing the end of the session. We have 4 minutes left. Just a quick question perhaps. Does conducting international research apply to master's students? And a second one, what are the chances of applying in a university again if one has been placed on a waiting list? I'd suggest that we close the questions now and perhaps try to answer these last ones. So international research for masters, I think, Ollie, that was the response to your exhortation to research internationally rather than just sort of be parochialized.
Okay, I mean, I don't think there's a yes/no answer to that question, right? It depends on what masters you're applying to. Again, it fits back to this thing of the narrative, the reason, right? So don't just be international because let's be international. You know, if you're, I mean, okay, to give you an example of a research project I've recently funded on a committee I sit on. It's not a master's project, but I think the same logic applies why we chose it. Someone was doing something about revenue administration and bureaucracies and how they report to each other, and they decided to do a comparative thing between Nigeria and Zambia and a third country. And they had chosen those countries because they're all at the same stage with this particular process that's happening. Yeah. So there is a logic to why an international study would be suitable at that point, right? And this makes sense within what they're applying to do. And this is why it would be better than a one country study, you know? And so it's about the logic, how it fits with the particular study you're going to do, you know? But I think so, just add it to your basket of options that, oh, or is it something, you know, just as Aki says about methodology, or is it a kind of comparison? Another person did a very nice PhD a few years back, is now an academic in Leiden, comparing what I like about this, it's not on a country basis, it's on a city basis, multi-ethnic politics in Amsterdam and Kano, you know? So you can think creatively about your units of analysis, and it speaks back to the kind of thing that Akin was talking about. But whether masters or not, it depends what masters, it depends on the context. It's all about fit.
All right, we have a few questions. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative because we have 2 minutes. Please interrupt me if there's something really important you want to add. So 2 questions about reapplying after rejection or being put on a waiting list. My view is it's always worth reapplying, but think about the comments that you've had on your original application. It's usually not worth applying with exactly the same kind of application, but work on it and improve it, get as much feedback on it as you can. The second question was about the most important documents to send to somebody to initiate a conversation. I would say, following from the conversation we've had here, that is a draft research proposal and a CV. Panelists, please correct me if I'm wrong. I would like to thank all of you, thank all the panelists for having made time in their very busy days for this conversation here with us on the panel. And I'd also like to thank our audience for their really lively interaction, the excellent questions, and also for your interest. You know, we appreciate it, and obviously we hope that you've taken something valuable from this session, and we wish all of you the very best of luck for the future and your future careers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hopefully there will be a recording of this on the LSA webpage.
Bye.
Bye.
With your applications, everyone.
So I thought we would be thrown out automatically and have that music restored. Super.
I think
Nice
you have
see
to
you.
throw us out. See you around
All
6.
right, okay. I'll see you then. Bye. Bye, everyone.